Marcus Thorne discovered the prophecy on a Thursday evening in October, in the back room of an antique shop he'd entered only because rain had started falling with unexpected violence, and the doorway offered shelter from the deluge that transformed the street into a rushing channel of dirty water, carrying leaves and cigarette butts and all the accumulated debris of urban existence. The shop was called Remnants, a name that promised exactly what it delivered: the discarded possessions of the dead, the forgotten artifacts of lives that had ended or simply moved on, leaving behind objects that had once mattered to someone but now existed only as curiosities for strangers who would never understand their original significance or emotional weight. The proprietor was absent, had been absent, according to the faded sign on the counter since 4:30 p.m., though the door had been unlocked and the lights remained on, as if inviting customers despite the posted closing time. Marcus wandered through narrow aisles lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of too many things that no one wanted: chipped teacups, tarnished silverware, leather-bound books whose spines had cracked and whose pages had yellowed to the color of old bone, photographs of people whose names had been forgotten, along with the contexts that had made those particular moments worth preserving. The back room was darker than the rest of the shop, illuminated only by weak light filtering through a doorway that led to what might have been office or storage space. Marcus entered without conscious decision, drawn by the particular quality of the shadows, by the sense that this space contained something that wanted to be found, that had been waiting with patient inevitability for exactly the right person to stumble into its presence. The mirror hung on the far wall, positioned at height that suggested it had been mounted deliberately rather than simply leaned against the plaster. The frame was blackened wood, not painted but charred, as if the mirror had survived a fire that had consumed everything around it, while leaving the glass itself intact and functional. The surface was dark, reflective but wrong, showing Marcus's outline without capturing proper detail, rendering him as silhouette rather than fully realized figure. And then the glass changed. Not suddenly, not with dramatic transformation that would suggest magical intervention or supernatural manifestation. Just gradually, almost imperceptibly, letters forming on the surface as if the mirror was remembering something, as if information was rising from depths beneath the reflective layer, as if the glass was medium rather than mere object, was interface between this reality and some other realm where knowledge existed, independent of observation or verification. The words appeared in elegant script that looked handwritten, despite being somehow etched or embedded or projected onto the mirror's surface. "You will love her." Marcus stared at the sentence, processing its presumption, its certainty, its claim to know his future emotional state, despite having no access to his thoughts or desires, or the complex web of circumstances that would need to align before love became possible or appropriate or even desirable. He almost laughed, would have laughed if the next line hadn't appeared before amusement could fully form. "She will die." The words settled into his consciousness with weight that exceeded their simple declarative structure, with implications that spread through his awareness like ink dropped into water, coloring everything they touched. Not "she might die" or "she could die," but the absolute certainty of "will die," the grammatical construction that eliminated possibility and replaced it with inevitability, that transformed future from realm of potential outcomes into single predetermined conclusion. "You will be alone." Marcus reached toward the mirror without thinking, fingers extending to touch the glass, to verify its physical reality, to confirm he was actually seeing what his eyes reported rather than experiencing hallucination or stress-induced vision or some other breakdown of normal perception. His fingertips met cold surface that vibrated slightly under contact, that seemed to pulse with faint rhythm like heartbeat or breathing, or the oscillation of some mechanism operating just below threshold of conscious detection. The words remained. Didn't fade when touched, didn't vanish when he blinked or looked away, or attempted any of the usual methods people employed when trying to dispel visual anomalies that shouldn't exist. They persisted with the stubborn reality of physical objects, of text that had been written and would remain written regardless of his attention or belief or desperate hope that this was somehow mistake, somehow error, somehow anything except genuine prophecy, describing future he couldn't yet see, but was apparently already determined. Marcus left the shop without purchasing anything, without speaking to proprietor who never appeared despite the unlocked door and the lit interior. He walked home through rain that had decreased to drizzle, through streets that looked exactly as they always looked, through a world that seemed utterly unchanged, despite the knowledge now sitting in his mind like foreign object, like splinter that had embedded itself too deep for easy extraction. He almost convinced himself he'd imagined it, almost succeeded in categorizing the experience as random neural misfire, as brain producing meaning from meaningless stimuli, as the human tendency to see patterns even in pure noise, generating coherent message from the chaotic reflections and shadows of an old mirror in a darkened room. Almost, but not quite. Because the words had felt true in a way that transcended rational assessment, in a way that bypassed his skepticism, and connected directly to some deeper knowledge that recognized prophecy when it appeared, that understood certain futures were fixed, regardless of present choices or desperate interventions. He met her 6 days later. Elara Chen worked at the public library 3 blocks from Marcus's apartment, in the reference section where she helped patrons navigate databases and locate obscure sources, and generally served as guide through the increasingly complex landscape of information that characterized modern research. Marcus had been there dozens of times over the years. He was freelance researcher himself, made his living tracking down facts and verifying sources and assembling reports for clients who needed information but lacked time or expertise to find it themselves, but had never noticed her before, had never registered her presence among the other librarians who staffed the desks and shelves and computer stations. But on this particular Wednesday afternoon, when Marcus approached the reference desk to ask about access to historical newspaper archives, Elara looked up from her screen and their eyes met, and something fundamental shifted in Marcus's understanding of the world. Something that felt like recognition despite never having seen her before. Something that suggested this moment had always been inevitable, had been waiting to occur since long before either of them existed, had been scripted into the basic structure of reality itself. She was beautiful in ways that photographs wouldn't capture, in ways that transcended mere arrangement of features, and had everything to do with how she moved, how she spoke, how her attention focused with absolute presence on whoever she was addressing. She wore her hair pulled back in simple style that suggested practicality rather than aesthetic concern. Her eyes were dark and carried sadness that wasn't depression or grief, but something quieter, something that looked like acceptance of truths most people spent their lives avoiding. "I need to access the Tribune archives," Marcus said, his voice sounding strange in his own ears, sounding like he was performing normalcy rather than actually experiencing it. Specifically, October 1952 through March 1953. Elara nodded, began typing on her computer, explaining the process for accessing digitized materials, for requesting hard copies of issues that hadn't been scanned yet, for navigating the library's systems and protocols. Marcus heard approximately half of what she said. The other half of his attention was consumed by noticing details, the slight asymmetry of her smile, the way her hands moved with careful precision, the faint scar on her left wrist that suggested old injury or surgery or some other encounter with damage that had healed but left permanent mark. He returned to the library the next day, and the day after. Not because he needed additional research assistance. His project could have been completed with the information she'd provided during that first interaction, but because proximity to her felt necessary in ways he couldn't articulate, in ways that suggested some part of him recognized what his conscious mind was still refusing to acknowledge, that the prophecy had been accurate, that he was already falling in love with this woman whose name he'd learned from her badge, but whose full existence remained mysterious, remained territory he desperately wanted to explore, despite the second line of the prophecy's message, despite the knowledge that loving her meant losing her, meant experiencing the death the mirror had predicted with such absolute certainty. She noticed his repeated visits. "You're here a lot," she observed during his fifth consecutive day at the library, her tone neutral, but carrying undertone of curiosity, of recognition that his presence exceeded what normal research would require. "I like the atmosphere," Marcus lied. "It's conducive to concentration." "Most people find it too quiet," Elara said. "Say it makes them uncomfortable, all that silence pressing down." "I'm comfortable with silence," Marcus replied, which was true in ways he didn't intend to explain, in ways that related to his childhood and his relationship with his parents, and the particular quality of isolation that had characterized most of his adult life, despite surface-level social connections and professional relationships that functioned adequately but never transcended into genuine intimacy. They began talking more during his visits. Brief conversations initially, exchanges about books or research methods or the peculiar characters who frequented the library, but gradually extending into longer discussions that ranged across philosophy and history and the shared observation that most people moved through life without really seeing what surrounded them, without noticing the details that made existence strange and terrible and occasionally beautiful. Marcus learned that Elara had moved to the city 2 years earlier after her mother's death, that she lived alone in a studio apartment in the neighborhood where property values hadn't yet risen enough to displace long-term residents, that she read constantly but preferred nonfiction to novels because fiction required believing in resolution, and she'd stopped believing that stories ended properly. She learned that Marcus worked independently, that he'd never been married or maintained long-term relationship, that he collected antique maps because he liked seeing how cartographers represented territories they'd never fully explored, liked the honesty of marking unknown regions with warnings about dragons or sea monsters, or simply leaving them blank. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Marcus returned to the antique shop. The mirror was exactly where he'd left it, still hanging in the back room, still reflecting without properly showing, still radiating that sense of patient waiting that characterized objects that possessed something more than mere physical substance. He stood before it without touching, without speaking, simply observing to see whether it would respond to his presence, whether it would offer additional information now that the first line of the prophecy had proven accurate. The glass shifted. Letters formed with the same gradual emergence, the same sense of information rising from depths. Day 14, she falls, neck broken, no witnesses. Marcus felt his stomach drop, felt the particular nausea that accompanies knowledge you desperately wish you didn't possess, knowledge that transforms future from abstract possibility into concrete threat requiring response. Day 14. 14 days from today. 2 weeks until Elara would fall. The prophecy didn't specify from where or under what circumstances, didn't provide enough detail for him to prevent the outcome, just enough to ensure he would spend the next 2 weeks in state of hypervigilant terror, watching for situations that might result in falling, monitoring her movements, attempting to protect her from fate that had already been written into whatever mechanism generated these predictions. He asked her to dinner that night. She accepted. They went to a small restaurant neither of them had been to before, ate food neither of them would remember afterward, talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, about the particular loneliness of modern urban existence, and the way technology had created connection without intimacy, and the strange persistence of hope, despite all available evidence, suggesting that hope was irrational response to universe that didn't care about human desires or needs. "Do you believe in fate?" Marcus asked as they walked back toward her apartment, both of them moving slowly to extend the evening, to postpone the separation that would occur when she reached her door, and he continued home. "I believe in consequences," Elara said. "Actions produce results. Choices have outcomes. But I don't believe in predestination. Don't believe the future is already written." Marcus wanted to tell her about the mirror, wanted to explain that the future was written, that he'd seen it, that her death was scheduled for day 14, and he didn't know how to prevent it, despite desperately wanting to save her from whatever fall would break her neck and leave her dead without witnesses. But he stayed silent, because telling her would sound insane. because prophecy wasn't something rational people believed in, because admitting he'd been visiting an antique shop to consult a mirror that predicted the future would destroy whatever fragile connection they'd been building, would transform him from potential romantic partner into concerning individual who required psychological evaluation and possibly medication. Day 14 approached with terrible speed. Marcus spent every possible moment with Elara, not just because he enjoyed her company, though he did, enjoyed it with intensity that frightened him, that made him understand why people throughout history had been willing to destroy themselves for love, but because monitoring her meant protection, meant being present to prevent the fall when it came, meant positioning himself between her and whatever circumstances would result in broken neck and absence of witnesses. She noticed his intensity. "You're being strange," she told him on day 12, when he'd insisted on walking her home despite rain and despite having no logical reason to be in her neighborhood at that hour. Not bad strange, just attentive in ways that feel like you're expecting something terrible. "I'm just careful," Marcus said, which was true but incomplete, was fraction of the full truth that he couldn't share without revealing the prophecy, without explaining that terrible wasn't expectation but certainty, wasn't paranoid projection but accurate prediction based on information from source. He couldn't explain without sounding delusional. Day 14 came with rain. Not the violent downpour that had driven Marcus into the antique shop 3 weeks earlier, but steady, persistent precipitation that made everything slick, that turned surfaces treacherous, that created exactly the conditions where falling became likely, where one misstep on wet pavement or slippery stairs could result in the kind of impact that would snap cervical vertebrae and sever spinal cord and terminate life before consciousness could even register what was happening. Elara finished work at 6 p.m. Her routine involved crossing the old iron bridge that spanned the narrow river, separating the library's neighborhood from her own, a pedestrian bridge built in 1907 and still maintained for foot traffic despite its age, despite the rust that had accumulated on its railings, despite the way it swayed slightly when wind picked up or when too many people crossed simultaneously. Marcus waited at the bridge's entrance, positioned where he could intercept her, where he could ensure she didn't cross alone. He'd checked the bridge earlier, had walked its length examining the railings, testing their stability, looking for obvious hazards that might cause the fall the prophecy had predicted. Everything had seemed solid, seemed safe, seemed like it would support normal pedestrian traffic without incident. But prophecies didn't lie. The mirror had told him day 14, had told him she would fall, had told him her neck would break and there would be no witnesses, except there would be a witness, because he would be there, because he'd positioned himself to intervene, to prevent, to save her from fate that claimed to be inevitable, but that Marcus refused to accept as unchangeable. Elara appeared at 6:17 p.m., walking with quick, precise steps despite the rain, holding small umbrella that barely kept her dry. She saw Marcus and smiled, genuine pleasure at his presence, the kind of expression that made his chest tighten with emotion he'd spent most of his adult life avoiding, because emotion meant vulnerability, meant the possibility of loss, meant opening yourself to pain that could destroy you if circumstances aligned badly. "You're getting soaked," she observed, noting that he wasn't carrying umbrella, that rain was plastering his hair to his skull and running down his face in rivulets. "I wanted to walk you home," Marcus said, "if that's okay." "It's more than okay," Elara replied, and moved closer to share her umbrella, creating intimacy that required them to walk pressed together, shoulders touching, their movements coordinating to maintain the small circle of relative dryness the umbrella provided. They stepped onto the bridge. The metal surface was slick with rain, glistening under the weak illumination from streetlights positioned at either end. The river below was swollen with recent precipitation, rushing past with unusual speed, carrying branches and trash, and the churned sediment that made the water opaque and threatening. Wind rose suddenly, not gradual increase, but immediate gust that seemed to come from nowhere, that struck with force that staggered them both, that transformed the umbrella from shelter into liability as it caught the wind and pulled Elara sideways toward the railing. She stumbled. Her foot caught on raised edge where deck plates met unevenly. The umbrella inverted with sharp crack of breaking spokes. She reached for the railing to stabilize herself, and the railing gave way. Not completely, not catastrophically, but enough. The ancient bolts that secured one section to its supporting posts had corroded over decades of exposure to weather and moisture and the constant cycle of thermal expansion and contraction. They'd been scheduled for replacement. Marcus would learn this later, would discover that maintenance had been planned but postponed due to budget constraints, that the bridge had been deemed safe for continued use despite minor deterioration because complete failure seemed unlikely. Seemed like the kind of worst-case scenario that planning accounted for, but reality rarely produced. Reality produced it now. The railing section tilted outward under Elara's weight, opening gap between deck and barrier, creating space where falling became possible, where the 20-foot drop to rushing water below transformed from theoretical danger into immediate threat. Marcus grabbed her. Didn't think about it, didn't plan the movement, just reacted with speed, born from having spent 2 weeks anticipating exactly this moment, having visualized exactly this scenario, having prepared himself mentally to act when the prophecy manifested, despite not knowing precise form it would take. His hand closed around her wrist. Her momentum was already carrying her toward the opening in the railing, already pulling her into empty air above the river. He yanked backward with strength, enhanced by adrenaline and terror, and the absolute determination that she would not die, would not fulfill the prophecy's prediction, would not become another victim of fate that Marcus refused to accept as inevitable. They fell together, not through the gap in the railing, not toward the river, but backward onto the bridge deck, landing hard enough to drive air from his lungs, hard enough that pain shot through his back and shoulder where he absorbed most of the impact. Elara landed on top of him, gasping, shaking, alive, her neck unbroken, her body intact, her heart beating against his chest where she lay pressed against him in the rain. "What just happened?" she asked, voice high with shock, with the particular disorientation that accompanies near-death experience, with the sudden understanding of how close she'd come to ending, to simply ceasing to exist in the space between one moment and the next. "The railing gave way," Marcus said, still holding her wrist, still maintaining physical contact, as if releasing her might allow the prophecy another opportunity, might permit reality to correct itself and arrange her death through some alternative mechanism. "You're okay, you're safe." They lay there for several seconds before standing, before assessing damage, before acknowledging that Marcus had saved her life through intervention that wouldn't have occurred if he hadn't been present, if he hadn't been waiting specifically to prevent the fall the prophecy had predicted, which meant he'd changed the future, had altered what the mirror claimed was certain, had proven that prophecy could be wrong, could be defeated, could be overcome through human action and determination and the refusal to accept predetermined outcomes. Marcus felt triumph, felt vindication, felt the particular satisfaction that comes from defeating mechanism that claimed absolute authority, from proving that choice mattered despite prophecy, from saving the woman he loved. And he did love her, realized in that moment that love wasn't future development, but present reality, wasn't something that would happen, but something that already had happened, that existed fully formed in the instant he'd grabbed her wrist and pulled her back from the void that had opened to receive her. He walked her home, made sure she was truly uninjured beyond bruises and shock, promised to check on her tomorrow, kissed her carefully at her door, their first kiss, tentative and sweet and carrying the weight of having survived something together, of having crossed boundary between friendship and something deeper through circumstance that was tragic and terrible and somehow also perfect because it had happened and they'd survived it, and they were here together in this moment. He returned to the antique shop that night, driven by need to see the mirror, to confirm that the prophecy had failed, to verify that the future had changed and the predicted death had been prevented. The mirror showed him something new. Day 21, carbon monoxide, sleeping, peaceful. Marcus stared at the words, feeling triumph curdle into something else, feeling understanding dawn with terrible clarity. The prophecy hadn't failed. The prophecy had adapted, had updated itself to reflect the intervention, to accommodate the change, to identify new method of death that would occur 7 days from now through mechanism that was completely different from falling, through cause that Marcus's vigilance against physical accidents wouldn't prevent because carbon monoxide poisoning happened silently, invisibly, while victims slept and never woke. The mirror had learned, had adjusted its prediction based on his intervention, had demonstrated that preventing one death didn't save Elara, but merely postponed her ending, merely shifted the method, merely forced the prophecy to select alternative path that would still arrive at the same destination. Elara dead, Marcus alive, both of them fulfilling the roles the mirror had assigned them, regardless of how desperately Marcus fought against the assigned outcome. He understood then what he was facing. Not simple prediction that could be disproven through contrary action, but something more sophisticated, something that possessed intelligence, or at minimum, operated according to logic, that could adapt, that could respond to changes, that could update its predictions to account for interference, and still maintain accuracy about ultimate result, even if intermediate steps required modification. The prophecy wasn't just seeing the future, it was shaping it, was establishing parameters, and then watching Marcus struggle against those parameters while it adjusted methods to maintain the predetermined conclusion that mattered. Elara would die. The exact mechanism was negotiable, the timing could shift, the circumstances could vary, but the outcome remained fixed, regardless of Marcus's interventions or desperate attempts to protect her. Unless he could identify the pattern, could understand the rules, could discover what the prophecy wanted beyond simply Elara's death, what purpose her killing served in whatever larger mechanism generated these predictions and ensured their accuracy. He spent day 15 through day 20 in state of controlled paranoia, monitoring Elara's apartment building for carbon monoxide sources, checking her furnace and water heater, installing detectors in her bedroom and kitchen and living space, explaining his concern as general safety consciousness rather than specific knowledge of predicted death, because telling her the truth would require explaining the prophecy, and he still couldn't figure out how to do that without sounding insane. Day 21 approached. Marcus arranged to stay with Elara that night, manufactured excuse about his apartment being treated for pest infestation, suggested he could sleep on her couch if she didn't mind having company. She agreed, seemed pleased actually, seemed to welcome his presence in ways that suggested their relationship had progressed to point where overnight stays were natural rather than presumptuous, where physical proximity was comfort rather than intrusion. He didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Lay on her couch in the darkness, monitoring the carbon monoxide detectors he'd installed, watching for the alarm that would indicate deadly gas was accumulating, ready to evacuate her immediately if levels rose enough to trigger the sensors. The detectors remained silent. The levels stayed normal. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. Each hour bringing them closer to day 22, closer to the moment when the prophecy's window would close, when day 21 would end without Elara dying from carbon monoxide poisoning while sleeping peacefully. 3 a.m. arrived. Marcus allowed himself to believe they'd succeeded again, that he'd prevented the second death. That his intervention, installing the detectors, staying present, maintaining vigilance, had defeated the prophecy's updated prediction. 4 a.m. Elara woke briefly, went to the bathroom, returned to bed without fully achieving consciousness, the kind of half-awake navigation people perform when bladder signals override sleep but mind remains mostly dormant. 5 a.m. The alarm on Marcus's phone vibrated. He'd set it to ensure he stayed awake, to prevent him from dozing off during the vigil, from allowing sleep to create vulnerability that the prophecy might exploit. 6 a.m. The sun began to rise. Day 21 was ending. Day 22 was beginning. Elara was alive, breathing, sleeping peacefully in her bedroom while Marcus remained on the couch, surrounded by carbon monoxide detectors that had never triggered because there was no leak, no danger, no source of the poisoning the prophecy had predicted. Marcus returned to the mirror that evening. Day 28, subway platform, pushed, cameras malfunction. The prophecy had updated again, had selected third method, had demonstrated that preventing previous deaths only delayed the outcome, only forced selection of alternative mechanisms, only proved that Marcus could win individual battles, but the war was already decided, already scripted, already determined by whatever intelligence operated through the mirror to ensure Elara's death, regardless of how many specific attempts Marcus managed to prevent. This was when Marcus noticed the first gap. Nothing major, nothing that suggested immediate concern. Just a momentary inability to recall specific detail about his past, the name of his elementary school, the street where he'd lived as a child, some piece of personal history that should have been easily accessible but had somehow become unavailable, had been filed somewhere his conscious mind couldn't reach. He dismissed it as stress, as sleep deprivation, as the normal cognitive degradation that accompanied sustained anxiety and hypervigilance, and the constant mental effort of anticipating dangers and planning interventions and carrying the weight of knowledge that your actions might determine whether someone lived or died. But when he prevented the subway death by convincing Elara to work from home that day, by manufacturing emergency that required her presence elsewhere, by ensuring she was nowhere near the platform where the prophecy claimed she would be pushed, the gap became wider, became more noticeable, became impossible to dismiss as simple stress response. He couldn't remember his father's face, could remember facts about him, occupation, hobbies, the date he died, but the actual visual image, the specific arrangement of features that had characterized the man Marcus had called Dad for 23 years before cancer had claimed him, had simply vanished from accessible memory, had been deleted or archived or relocated to space. Marcus's consciousness could no longer reach. The mirror updated to day 35. House fire, blocked exits, no time to escape. Marcus prevented it by disabling Elara's stove, by checking all electrical outlets, by ensuring there were multiple fire extinguishers and clear paths to exits and smoke detectors throughout her apartment. His mother's voice disappeared from his memory. He could remember conversations with her, could recall content and context, but the actual sound of her voice, the specific timbre and accent and pattern of speech that had been uniquely hers, had been erased as if it had never existed. Day 42. Allergic reaction. Anaphylactic shock, no EpiPen nearby. Marcus obtained complete list of Elara's allergies, removed all potential allergens from her environment, ensured she carried multiple EpiPens, educated himself on emergency response protocols. The taste of his favorite food vanished. Then the memory of his first kiss. Then his ability to recall song lyrics that he'd known by heart for decades. Piece by piece, moment by moment, detail by detail, his personal history was being disassembled, was being taken as payment for each intervention, as cost for preventing each predicted death. And he understood finally what the prophecy actually wanted, understood its true purpose, understood that Elara's death was never the goal, but merely the mechanism, merely the tool, merely the method by which the prophecy achieved its actual objective. It wanted Marcus empty, wanted him hollowed out, wanted to erase every memory, every experience, every element of personal history, an emotional connection, an accumulated identity until nothing remained except the basic function of prediction and prevention, until he existed only as extension of the prophecy itself, until Marcus Thorne ceased to be person and became simply the mechanism by which the mirror's predictions were simultaneously generated and thwarted in endless cycle that served no purpose except perpetuating itself. Memory for memory, life for life. The words appeared on the mirror unprompted, confirming what Marcus had deduced, making explicit the exchange that had been occurring with each intervention, clarifying the rules of the game he'd been playing without understanding the stakes or the true cost of apparent victory. Every time he saved Elara, he lost piece of himself. Every time he prevented her death, he paid with fragment of his own existence. Not his life. The prophecy didn't want him dead, wanted him alive and functional and capable of continuing the cycle. But his self, his identity, his accumulated experiences and relationships, and all the specific details that made Marcus Thorne an individual rather than just generic human consciousness occupying generic human body. The prophecy wasn't fueled by death, it was fueled by fear of loss, by Marcus's terror that Elara would die, by his desperate determination to save her regardless of cost, by his willingness to sacrifice anything, including himself, including his own identity, including everything that made him him, to prevent her death. And with each sacrifice, with each piece of himself he surrendered to purchase her continued survival, the prophecy grew stronger, grew more integrated with his consciousness, grew closer to achieving its true goal of replacing Marcus entirely, of consuming him so completely that he would become nothing except the process of prediction and prevention, nothing except the cycle itself, nothing except the prophecy operating through human form. By day 56, Marcus had prevented 8 deaths, had saved Elara from falling, from carbon monoxide, from being pushed, from fire, from allergic reaction, from car accident, from food poisoning, from electrical shock. Each time the prophecy updated with new method, new timeline, new mechanism that would result in her death if Marcus didn't intervene. And each time he intervened successfully, more of his identity disappeared. His childhood became blur of generic memories without specific detail. His relationships with family and friends reduced to abstract knowledge that these connections had existed without ability to recall actual experiences or emotional content. His own history became story someone had told him about person named Marcus Thorne rather than lived experience he could genuinely remember. Even his love for Elara was changing, was becoming less feeling and more concept, less emotion and more function, less the rich, complex experience of genuine human connection, and more simply the operational principle that drove his continued interventions. She must not die, therefore he would prevent her death. Therefore the prophecy would update, therefore he would prevent the next death. Therefore the cycle would continue until nothing remained of Marcus except the bare minimum consciousness required to maintain the pattern. Elara noticed what was happening to him. She wasn't blind, wasn't oblivious, had been watching Marcus carefully since the bridge incident, since the moment when his presence at exactly the right time had saved her from exactly the kind of accident that shouldn't have been predictable, that shouldn't have been anticipated, that suggested knowledge he couldn't have possessed through normal means. She found the mirror by accident, or perhaps not accident, perhaps inevitability, perhaps the prophecy itself, arranging the discovery, because having Elara know was part of the pattern, was necessary element of whatever conclusion the mirror was engineering. Marcus had been sleeping, actually sleeping for first time in days, exhaustion finally overwhelming his determination to remain vigilant, his body shutting down despite his mind's protests because biological limits eventually imposed themselves regardless of will or need or desperate commitment to protection. Elara had been looking for his phone to check alarm settings, wanting to ensure it would wake him before work, wanting to take care of him the way he'd been taking care of her with such obsessive thoroughness. She'd found instead the address of the antique shop written on scrap of paper in his jacket pocket. Had decided, with the particular curiosity that characterizes people who sense they're not receiving full truth but can't quite identify what's being hidden, to visit the location, to see what connection Marcus might have to place he'd never mentioned despite their months of increasingly intimate conversation. The shop door was unlocked. The back room was accessible. The mirror was waiting. It showed her everything. Not gradually, not with the careful, measured revelation it had employed with Marcus, all at once. Complete information delivered in single, overwhelming cascade of text that scrolled across the surface like credits at movie's end. She sees, she understands, she chooses, followed by comprehensive history of all the deaths Marcus had prevented, all the memories he'd lost, all the pieces of himself he'd surrendered to purchase her continued existence, followed by explanation of the prophecy's true purpose, its actual goal, its method of consuming identity by exploiting fear of loss and transforming love into mechanism of self-destruction, followed by the current prediction, day 63. She chooses to end the cycle. Window, night, no intervention possible. When Marcus woke, Elara was sitting on his couch in his apartment. She'd used the key he'd given her 3 weeks earlier, had let herself in while he slept, had been waiting for hours for him to wake so they could have conversation she'd been preparing since leaving the antique shop. "You've been trading yourself for me," she said before he could speak, before he could ask how she'd gotten in or why she looked like someone who'd received devastating news, before he could attempt any of the deflections or explanations or partial truths he'd been using to avoid full disclosure. "Every time you save me, it takes another piece of you. Every time the prophecy updates, you lose more of who you were." Marcus sat up slowly, his body heavy with exhaustion, his mind struggling to process that she knew that the secret he'd been protecting had been revealed, that whatever came next would occur with both of them fully aware of the situation rather than him bearing the knowledge alone. "I couldn't let you die," he said simply, because there was no point in denial, no value in pretending she hadn't discovered the truth, no way to unexplain what she'd learned from the mirror. "It doesn't stop," Elara continued, her voice carrying weight of someone who'd spent hours thinking through implications, who'd examined the pattern from every angle, who'd arrived at conclusions Marcus had been avoiding despite their terrible inevitability. "Every time you save me, it gets smarter. Every time you love me, it gets closer to consuming you completely. You'll keep preventing my deaths until there's nothing left of you except the function of prevention itself. Until Marcus Thorne stops existing, and all that remains is the prophecy operating through human shell that used to be person." "I won't let you die," Marcus repeated, the phrase having become almost mantra, almost prayer, almost the only thought his increasingly hollowed consciousness could reliably maintain. "That's not what it wants," Elara said quietly. "It doesn't want me dead. It wants you empty. It's using me, using your love for me, using your fear of losing me, to erase you piece by piece until you become what it needs you to become." "I don't care," Marcus said, and meant it with what remained of his capacity for meaning things, with the fragment of himself that could still feel emotion rather than just understanding emotion as abstract concept. "You being alive matters more than me remembering who I was." Elara stood, crossed to where Marcus sat, knelt in front of him so their eyes were level. "That's why this ends," she said. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not letting you destroy yourself to save me. I'm not accepting survival purchased with your erasure. I'm not allowing the prophecy to win by consuming you, even if it means—" She stopped, swallowed, continued with visible effort, "even if it means accepting my death." Marcus felt something crack inside him, some last barrier between his current hollowed state and complete dissolution. "No, you can't. I won't let you." "You don't have choice," Elara said gently. "The mirror showed me day 63, showed me that I choose to end the cycle, showed me there's no intervention possible because intervention requires your ability to act, and on day 63 you won't be capable of preventing what I choose to do." "I'll find a way," Marcus insisted desperately. "I'll stop you somehow. You'll become the prophecy," Elara finished. "That's what happens if this continues. That's the final outcome. Not my death, but your transformation into the mechanism itself, into something that exists only to predict and prevent and consume anyone else who comes after me, anyone else you might love, anyone else the mirror can use to feed itself through your fear of loss." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to maintain eye contact, to see the certainty in her expression, to understand that she'd made decision that couldn't be argued against or reasoned away or prevented through superior force of will. "I love you," she said. "That's why I'm ending this. That's why I'm choosing to die before the prophecy finishes erasing you. Because love isn't about possession or protection or preventing loss at any cost. Love is about recognizing when saving someone means destroying yourself and choosing not to make that trade even when every instinct screams to do whatever necessary to keep them alive." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to fight, wanted to explain that he'd already lost too much to stop now, that the sacrifices he'd made would be meaningless if Elara died anyway, that accepting her death would mean the prophecy had won completely rather than just partially. But he was too empty to argue effectively, too hollowed to maintain the energy required for genuine dispute, too far gone to access the emotional resources that would fuel sustained resistance. So he just held her, just wrapped his arms around her and pressed his face against her shoulder and felt her breathing and her heartbeat and the terrible fragile miracle of her continued existence that he'd purchased with pieces of himself He couldn't remember losing, but could feel the absence of in the gaps where memories should exist and didn't. Day 63 came with rain. Marcus woke to find Elara already gone from his apartment, already back in her own space, already preparing for whatever she'd decided to do to end the cycle and free him from the prophecy's consuming mechanism. He tried to go to her, found he couldn't, not because of physical restraint, but because his body wouldn't respond to his intention to move, wouldn't translate thought into action, wouldn't perform the basic functions required to cross distance between his apartment and hers. The prophecy was holding him, not with visible force, not with anything that could be fought or resisted, just with the simple fact that intervention was no longer possible because Marcus no longer existed sufficiently to intervene, because he'd been reduced to consciousness without agency, awareness without capacity for action, presence without power to affect outcomes. He could only watch, could only wait, could only experience with terrible clarity the hours passing toward evening, toward night, toward whatever moment Elara had chosen for the ending she'd decided was necessary. His phone rang at 11:47 p.m., Elara's number. He answered. "I love you," she said, her voice carrying weight of finality, of someone delivering last message before crossing boundary between existence and absence. Remember that. When the prophecy tries to make you forget, when it tries to take even this, remember that I loved you, that we were real, that what we had mattered, even though it couldn't last. "Please don't," Marcus managed to say, the words emerging as broken sound that barely qualified as speech. "You don't have to be the hero," Elara said gently. "You don't have to win. You just have to remain yourself. Have to refuse to become what the prophecy wants you to become. Have to hold on to enough of Marcus Thorne that when this is over, when I'm gone, something of you still exists beyond just the mechanism." "I can't. You can," she interrupted, "because I'm choosing this. I'm choosing to die so you can live, so you can remain human instead of becoming prophecy. So the mirror doesn't win even if it gets my death." She was quiet for a moment. Marcus heard wind through her phone's microphone, heard distant traffic, heard all the ambient sounds of city at night. Then she spoke again. "Thank you for loving me, for trying to save me, for sacrificing so much, but it's time to stop now. It's time to let me go." The call ended. Marcus couldn't move, couldn't act, could only exist in state of paralyzed awareness as minutes passed, as midnight approached, as Elara made whatever choice she decided would end the cycle and free him from the prophecy's consumption. The mirror, which he hadn't returned to, which he'd been avoiding because seeing the updated predictions only made the suffering worse, appeared in his mind with perfect clarity despite his closed eyes, despite the distance, despite his desperate attempt to avoid knowing what was happening. It showed him Elara standing at her window, 9th floor, height sufficient for fall that would be unsurvivable. She was looking out at the city, at the lights and the rain and the beautiful, terrible world she was preparing to leave. She turned toward the window, opened it. Cold air rushed in, carrying rain and the sounds of the city and the particular quality of atmosphere that preceded significant events, moments that divided time into before and after. She climbed onto the windowsill, stood balanced on the narrow ledge, looked down at the street below. Marcus screamed, tried to scream, wanted to scream, needed to scream, but no sound emerged because the prophecy had taken even that, had stolen even his capacity to vocalize protest or grief or desperate plea for her to stop. Elara didn't look back, didn't hesitate, didn't perform any of the dramatic gestures people expect from final moments. She just stepped forward into empty air. The fall took 3 seconds. The impact was immediate. Final. Exactly as the prophecy had promised. Death without intervention, death chosen rather than imposed, death that ended the cycle because Elara had removed herself from the pattern, had refused to continue being the tool the prophecy used to consume Marcus piece by piece. The mirror went dark, not shattered, not destroyed, just dark, empty, showing nothing except Marcus's own reflection, and in that reflection, for first time in weeks, he saw himself properly, saw Marcus Thorne rather than hollow outline, saw a person who still existed despite the losses, despite the gaps, despite the memories that had been taken. Because Elara had been right. Her death wasn't the prophecy's victory. Her choosing to die meant the prophecy had lost its mechanism, had lost its method of consuming Marcus, had been forced to release its grip because the fear of losing her no longer applied when she was already gone. The pieces of himself the prophecy had taken began returning, not immediately, not dramatically, just gradually, like memories emerging from fog, like consciousness reassembling after being scattered. His father's face, his mother's voice, his childhood, his experiences, his identity. Elara's death had saved him, had prevented his transformation into the prophecy, had ensured that Marcus Thorne would remain Marcus Thorne instead of becoming empty vessel for prediction and prevention, instead of being consumed so completely that nothing remained except the mechanism itself. He collapsed, lay on his floor surrounded by the returning memories, the reassembling identity, the terrible gift Elara had given him through her sacrifice. He could feel everything again, not just abstract knowledge of emotion, but actual feeling, actual grief, actual love, mixed with loss, mixed with gratitude, mixed with rage at the unfairness of universe that had forced this choice, that had required her death to preserve his existence. Years passed. The antique shop closed. The building was demolished. The mirror was presumably destroyed along with everything else, crushed beneath rubble and hauled away to landfill, where it would rest among all the other discarded objects that no one wanted or needed anymore. Marcus continued living, continued working, continued existing in a world that felt simultaneously more vivid and more empty than before. More real, because his full capacity for experience had been restored, but more hollow, because Elara wasn't in it, wasn't there to share the restored memories and rebuilt identity and the person he'd become after losing and recovering, and finally understanding what the prophecy had been trying to take from him. He never loved again, couldn't risk it, couldn't allow himself to care so deeply for another person when he knew from experience what love could cost, what sacrifice it could demand, what terrible choices it could force upon people who thought affection was simple emotion rather than complex mechanism, with power to destroy or save depending on how it was deployed and what external forces decided to exploit it. But sometimes, on quiet nights when sleep wouldn't come and memory felt particularly heavy, Marcus thought he saw the mirror again. Not physically, not in any location he could identify or return to, just in reflections, in windows, in puddles, in any surface that could show him his own image and suggest that other things might be visible beyond the immediate obvious reality. The mirror wasn't destroyed, couldn't be destroyed, was somewhere waiting for next person who would stumble into the antique shop or encounter it in different location, or simply become aware of its existence through whatever mechanism connected people to cursed objects that needed victims to sustain themselves. And when they found it, when they saw their first prophecy, when they fell in love, when they began the cycle of prevention and loss and gradual erosion of everything they were, Marcus hoped they would be smart enough, or lucky enough, or desperate enough to make the choice Elara had made, to end the pattern before the prophecy consumed them completely, to refuse transformation even if refusal meant accepting loss, because the prophecy had failed, had been forced to release Marcus, had been defeated not through prevention or intervention, but through Elara's willingness to remove herself from the equation, to die on her own terms, rather than allowing her existence to become the mechanism of his destruction. The mirror was afraid. Marcus understood this now. The prophecy was afraid because it had learned that some people would choose death over being used, would choose loss over transformation, would choose to break the pattern, even when breaking it meant sacrificing themselves. And fear was weakness. Fear meant vulnerability. Fear meant the prophecy could be defeated if people recognized the actual threat wasn't the predicted deaths, but the process of prediction itself, wasn't the loss they were fighting against, but the erosion they were accepting to prevent that loss. Marcus stood alone in his apartment, remembering Elara, missing Elara, carrying the weight of her sacrifice and the gift of his preserved identity, and the knowledge that he'd been loved enough for someone to die to save him from fate worse than death. The mirror had wanted to turn him into prophecy, had wanted to consume his identity and use his fear to perpetuate itself, had wanted Marcus to become the mechanism. It had failed, because of Elara, because of her choice. Because of love that expressed itself through release rather than desperate clinging, through acceptance rather than futile resistance, through willingness to end rather than allowing the pattern to continue. The mirror had failed, but it was still waiting, still existing somewhere, still ready for the next person who would fall in love and see the prophecy and begin the terrible cycle. And Marcus, whole again, human again, himself again, could only hope they would be as fortunate as he'd been. Could only hope someone would love them enough to choose death over allowing the prophecy to win. Could only hope the mirror would fail again, and again, and again, until finally, eventually, perhaps never, it learned that some things couldn't be predicted, some choices couldn't be anticipated, some love was stronger than fear of loss, and prophecies, no matter how certain they seemed, could be refused. Epilogue: The Mirror Remembers. 10 years passed before Marcus saw the mirror again. He'd convinced himself it was gone, destroyed in the demolition, buried beneath tons of concrete and steel and the accumulated debris of a building that had stood for over a century before being cleared to make room for luxury condominiums that promised modern urban living to people who could afford the astronomical rents the developers were asking. He'd watched the demolition from across the street, had witnessed the wrecking ball reduce brick and mortar to rubble, had felt grim satisfaction at the thought that the mirror was being crushed along with everything else, that whatever metaphysical properties allowed it to predict futures and consume identities were being terminated through simple physical destruction. He'd been wrong. The mirror found him on a Tuesday evening in March, in a different antique shop, in a different neighborhood, in a different city, where Marcus had moved 3 years earlier, because staying in the place where Elara had died felt like living in a tomb, felt like inhabiting memorial rather than actual residence, felt like he was preserving her absence rather than continuing his own existence. He'd relocated to Portland, chosen randomly from list of cities he'd never visited, places that held no memories or associations or emotional weight that would anchor him to his past, when what he needed was forward movement, was new experiences, was the possibility of building life that didn't revolve around the gap where Elara should have been. He'd entered the shop seeking nothing in particular, just browsing on rainy afternoon when work had finished early, and his apartment felt too empty, and walking through streets filled with strangers seemed preferable to sitting alone with thoughts that inevitably circled back to the woman who'd loved him enough to die to save him from transformation into something inhuman. The shop was called Forgotten Histories, a name that promised exactly what it delivered: objects that had outlived their original owners and contexts, artifacts that had been separated from the narratives that gave them meaning, possessions that existed now only as curiosities for people who would never understand their true significance. Marcus had become collector of sorts over the intervening years, purchasing items that reminded him of Elara, antique books on subjects she'd loved, maps of places she'd wanted to visit, small, beautiful things that would have made her smile if she'd been alive to receive them. He was examining a collection of old postcards, hand-tinted photographs from the 1920s showing tourist destinations that had since been destroyed or radically transformed, when he felt it. That particular quality of attention that characterized being observed not just casually, but with focused intensity, with purpose that exceeded mere curiosity, with recognition that suggested the observer knew him despite his certainty that he'd never been in this shop before, had never met the proprietor who was currently helping another customer near the front. Marcus turned slowly, already knowing what he would see even before his eyes confirmed it, already feeling the sick certainty that settled into his stomach like stone, already understanding that some things couldn't be escaped through relocation or time or desperate hope that destruction had been thorough. The mirror hung on the back wall of the shop, positioned between a Victorian-era wardrobe and a display case containing antique jewelry. The frame was still charred wood, still showed evidence of fire that should have consumed it, but hadn't. The glass was still dark, still reflective, but wrong, still showing Marcus's outline without capturing proper detail. And words were already forming on its surface, letters emerging with the same gradual patience the mirror had demonstrated a decade earlier when it had first shown Marcus the prophecy that had destroyed his life and Elara's, that had forced them both into pattern that could only end in death or transformation or some combination of both that left survivors carrying permanent damage. You survived. Marcus's hands were shaking. He set down the postcards carefully, not trusting his grip, not wanting to drop them because maintaining composure felt crucial even when confronting object that had consumed months of his life and had cost Elara hers. She saved you. The words appeared without Marcus approaching, without him indicating any desire to read further messages, without his permission or consent, or any suggestion that he wanted communication with the mechanism that had nearly erased his identity through exploitation of his fear and love. But the prophecy didn't end. Marcus felt his throat close, felt panic rising despite the decade of distance, despite the healing he'd done, despite the therapy and the grief work and the painstaking reconstruction of his life around the Elara-shaped absence that would never fully heal but had at least become manageable, had at least transformed from acute agony into chronic ache that he could live with, even if he couldn't eliminate. It adapted. The mirror's surface rippled slightly, the way water responds to stone dropped into its depths, the way reality responds to introduction of element that doesn't belong but can't be rejected because it's already present, already integrated, already too late to prevent. You refused to love again. Marcus wanted to leave, wanted to turn and walk out of the shop and never return, never acknowledge the mirror's presence, never engage with whatever game it was attempting to initiate. But his feet wouldn't move. His body had frozen the same way it had frozen on day 63, when Elara had been preparing to die, and the prophecy had held him immobile, had prevented intervention by simply removing his capacity for action. That was wise. The compliment felt wrong, felt like predator acknowledging prey's successful evasion while simultaneously suggesting that success was temporary and was merely postponement, was illusion of safety that would eventually be revealed as false comfort before inevitable capture. But loneliness is another form of consumption. Marcus found his voice despite the fear, despite the paralysis, despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. What do you want? The words on the mirror didn't respond to his question directly. Instead, new text appeared. 10 years of isolation. 10 years of refusing connection. 10 years of preserving yourself by denying yourself. You haven't defeated the prophecy. You've become a different version of it. The observation landed with terrible accuracy, with the particular pain that comes from having uncomfortable truth spoken aloud, from having self-deception stripped away by external observer who sees clearly what you've been avoiding acknowledging. Because the mirror was right. Marcus had spent a decade refusing to love, refusing to risk, refusing to allow anyone close enough that losing them would matter. He'd preserved his identity by ensuring no one could threaten it, had protected himself from the prophecy's consumption by becoming his own jailer, his own isolator, his own mechanism of erasure, through the simple expedient of refusing to create new memories or connections or emotional bonds that might be vulnerable to exploitation. He'd saved himself from the prophecy by volunteering for a different kind of death, not the transformation into prediction mechanism that the mirror had originally threatened, but the gradual diminishment that came from living without love, without intimacy, without the risk and vulnerability and terrible, beautiful exposure that characterized genuine human connection. She died so you could remain human, but humanity requires more than mere survival. Marcus felt tears on his face without consciously deciding to cry, without any emotional buildup that would normally precede weeping, just immediate overflow, as if his body had been waiting for permission to release the accumulated grief and loneliness and desperate exhaustion of maintaining walls that kept him safe, but also kept him separate. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't risk it again. Can't love someone knowing what it costs. Can't allow myself to care that deeply when I understand what can be taken, what can be lost, what terrible choices love can force." Then she died for nothing. The words appeared with finality that felt like verdict, like judgment, like condemnation that Marcus couldn't argue against because it was simply true. If he spent his entire remaining life refusing to love because of what he'd lost, refusing to connect because of what connection could cost, then Elara's sacrifice had accomplished nothing except ensuring he'd exist in state of permanent isolation, had merely traded one form of erasure for another. I offer you a choice. Marcus laughed. Bitter sound without humor, sound that acknowledged the absurdity of prophecy offering choices when prophecies by definition eliminated choice through predetermination, through claiming to know outcomes before they occurred. Continue as you are, safe, isolated, slowly diminishing through absence of connection, or risk love again, risk loss again, risk the pattern repeating. But this time, the mirror paused. The pause felt deliberate, felt like dramatic timing, felt like the prophecy was ensuring Marcus would pay full attention to what came next. This time I will not interfere. This time the future will be genuinely uncertain. This time you will have what humans always claim to want: freedom from prophecy, freedom from predetermined outcomes, freedom to choose and fail and love and lose without knowing in advance. Marcus stared at the offer, trying to identify the trap, trying to understand what the prophecy gained from this arrangement, trying to determine why it would voluntarily relinquish the power it had demonstrated so thoroughly a decade earlier. Why? He asked. Why would you offer this? Why would you give up your ability to predict and consume? The mirror's response came slowly, as if the prophecy itself was uncertain, as if even mechanisms that operated across time and probability and the boundary between determination and free will could experience something like doubt or reconsideration. Because Elara taught me something. Taught me that some humans will choose death over becoming tools. Taught me that love can manifest as release rather than possession. Taught me that prophecy can fail when people refuse to play their assigned roles. I have existed for centuries. I have consumed countless identities. I have turned love into mechanism of erasure in more lives than you can imagine. But never before has anyone defeated me through willing sacrifice. Never before has victim chosen death to preserve someone else's humanity. Never before have I felt the text stopped. Marcus waited for it to continue, for the prophecy to complete the sentence, to explain what it had felt for the first time in its long existence. Never before have I felt uncertain about my purpose. The admission hung there on the darkened glass, confession from entity that shouldn't be capable of doubt, that existed to provide certainty, that operated on foundation of absolute knowledge about outcomes and futures and the predetermined nature of events. I learned from her. Now I offer you the same choice she made. Risk everything for the possibility of connection, or preserve yourself through isolation. Choose. Marcus stood in the antique shop, surrounded by objects that had outlived their owners, surrounded by the accumulated possessions of the dead, surrounded by evidence that everyone eventually lost everything, and that preservation was ultimately futile, because time eroded all things, including the determination to remain safe through avoidance of risk. He thought about Elara, about her smile and her sadness, and the way she'd looked at him with recognition rather than mere seeing, about the months they'd had together before the prophecy had forced its terrible choice, about her decision to die so he could remain himself, so the mirror wouldn't consume him, so love wouldn't become mechanism of erasure. She'd chosen risk. She'd chosen connection, despite knowing it would cost her life. She'd chosen Marcus's humanity over her own survival. And he'd spent a decade refusing to honor that choice by actually living, by actually remaining human in the full sense, rather than just technically not transformed, by actually allowing himself the vulnerability and exposure and terrible, beautiful risk that characterized genuine existence rather than mere survival. If I choose to risk love again, Marcus said slowly, if I allow myself to care deeply for someone, if I open myself to loss, you're promising the future will be genuinely uncertain? Promising you won't interfere? Promising prophecy won't consume either of us? Yes, with one condition. Marcus waited. You must choose soon. You must act before isolation becomes permanent. You must risk before fear calcifies into identity. You have 1 month, 30 days to allow yourself the possibility of love, 30 days to honor her sacrifice by actually living. After that, the offer expires. After that, your choice to remain isolated becomes permanent. I return. And next time, There will be no escape. The mirror went dark, not gradually, immediately. One moment displaying text, the next showing only Marcus's reflection, clear and detailed and properly rendered for the first time since he'd encountered the prophecy a decade earlier. He looked at himself in the glass, saw the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, saw the gray threading through his hair, saw the evidence of years spent alone, years spent safe, years spent refusing to risk because risk had already cost him everything that mattered. Saw a man who was alive but not living, who had survived, but at costs that might ultimately exceed the price Elara had paid. Marcus left the shop, stepped out into Portland rain, walked through streets filled with strangers who were living their lives, taking their risks, loving their people, losing their battles, winning their small victories, experiencing the full, messy, complicated, terrible, beautiful spectrum of human existence that Marcus had been avoiding since the night Elara had chosen to die to save him. 30 days. 1 month. A deadline that was simultaneously generous and cruel, offering enough time to act while ensuring that delay wouldn't be possible, that choosing isolation would require conscious decision rather than passive drift. Marcus pulled out his phone, opened the dating app he'd downloaded 6 months earlier but never actually used, had left sitting on his home screen like promise to himself that someday he might be ready to try again, might be willing to risk connection, might be capable of honoring Elara's sacrifice by actually living rather than merely surviving. He created a profile, uploaded photo, wrote bio that was honest about his past without revealing the impossible details that no one would believe anyway, started swiping, started looking, started allowing himself the possibility that love might happen again if he was willing to risk it, if he was willing to honor Elara's choice by making similar choice himself, if he was willing to accept that being human meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant potential loss, and loss was price of connection that was ultimately worth paying. 10 years of isolation, 10 years of safety, 10 years of slowly diminishing through absence of risk, 30 days to change that pattern, 30 days to prove the prophecy wrong by choosing uncertainty over guaranteed preservation, 30 days to honor Elara by living rather than merely surviving. Marcus swiped right on profile of woman who looked kind, who listed libraries among her interests, who reminded him slightly of Elara without being replacement, without being substitute, without being attempt to recreate what he'd lost. The app chimed. They'd matched. She'd sent a message, "Coffee sometime?" Marcus stared at the question for several seconds, feeling fear and hope and the terrible weight of choice. He could decline, could delete the app, could return to isolation that was safe but slowly killing him through attrition and absence. Or he could type yes, could risk connection, could honor Elara's sacrifice by actually living, could prove that her death had meant something beyond simply preserving him in amber, beyond keeping him safe through isolation, beyond teaching him to fear love so thoroughly that he'd spent a decade refusing it. His fingers moved before conscious decision could interfere. Typed 3 letters, yes. The prophecy had offered freedom, had promised not to interfere, had given him what humans always claimed to want, genuine uncertainty about the future, real possibility that things could work out or fail based on choices and circumstances and the complex interaction of free will and random chance, rather than predetermined outcomes written in darkened mirrors. Marcus didn't know if this woman would become important, didn't know if connection would develop, didn't know if love would happen or if loss would follow, or if the prophecy would keep its promise, or if this was all elaborate trap designed to consume him more thoroughly than the original pattern could have managed. He didn't know. And that uncertainty, that beautiful, terrible freedom from prophecy, was exactly what Elara had died to give him. So he would honor her by accepting it, by risking, by living, by refusing to let fear of loss prevent possibility of love. The mirror had learned from Elara, had discovered that prophecy could fail when people chose sacrifice over self-preservation, when love manifested as release rather than desperate clinging. Now Marcus would teach it something else, that humans could learn too, could change, could honor the dead by actually living rather than merely surviving in their memory, could refuse to become another form of prophecy by embracing uncertainty instead of seeking guaranteed safety. Could choose love despite knowing what it could cost. Because that's what being human meant. That's what Elara had preserved through her sacrifice. That's what the mirror was offering him chance to reclaim. 1 month, 30 days, a deadline and a promise and a challenge. Marcus accepted all three. And somewhere, in an antique shop in Portland, on a back wall between Victorian wardrobe and display of jewelry, a mirror showed no words, no prophecies, no predetermined futures, just a reflection, clear and honest, showing Marcus Thorne as he actually was, alive, uncertain, afraid, hopeful, human, ready to risk again, ready to love again, ready to honor Elara by refusing to let her sacrifice be wasted on a decade of isolation. The prophecy watched, waited, wondered if humans could truly learn, truly change, truly choose connection, despite knowing its cost. Marcus would show it, would prove that Elara's death had taught him not to avoid love, but to embrace it more fully, more honestly, more courageously than he'd been capable of before loss had taught him what mattered. 30 days until the offer expired. But for the first time in a decade, Marcus had something the prophecy never could predict or control or consume: hope.